order. We will take items in order as they appear on the agenda. We'll begin with item number 1, and this committee will commence as a subcommittee as we do not have a quorum at this time.
Item number 1, communication from the mayor relative to a summary of current gang reduction and youth development grants.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Laura Shin, Grants Director from Homeland Security and Public Safety. In terms of the grants funding for the youth service programs, there is approximately $5 million in grant funds that the mayor's office applies for in conjunction with the grid office. And the main funding source of those grant funds originates from the Department of Justice, mainly from their Bureau of Justice Assistance Agency, which their main goal is to provide funding to prevent crime and to improve criminal justice systems in local and state jurisdictions. Currently at this time, we have provided you with a chart of our funding sources.
Okay, thank you.
And what we've done is break down the 13 grants and combination of earmarks, and also broken down further to how those grant funds are allocated, specifically suppression, prevention, intervention, coordination, and administration of the grant. In addition, we've laid out the gang reduction zones that those funds are allocated towards.
Okay. So a total of over $13 million in grants, 13.4 million basically?
Correct. Grants and earmarks.
Okay. And it appears that by and large, these grants are heavily weighted toward the suppression end?
Well, if you look at the GRZ totals on the second page, there's approximately 5.8 million going towards suppression and 5.6 million towards the prevention and intervention services. So, you know, there's been an attempt to balance out the allocations and the funding.
There are programs of reentry occurring in and around the city of Los Angeles, but that's separate and apart from this, correct?
Yeah, we don't have any allocations for reentry at this time.
But it's not to say that reentry is not occurring in and around LA, it's just not part of these grants.
Correct.
Sure.
Jeff Carr from the Mayor's Office of Gang Reduction Youth Development. There is some money, I believe, that the Community Development Department is using presently to do some reentry stuff in Watts, a small percentage. And then, of course, the vast majority of the reentry money actually is in the probation department. So the city doesn't get much funds directly for reentry purposes.
So probation seems to be, because reentry is a little bit of a novelty, it's a new item in the state of California as far as allocating dollars to local communities, and it appears right now that it's more geared toward probation, at least in our city.
Yeah, for example, the Shift Cardenas dollars that really, I think, part of that was for prevention and also for this idea of intervention and reentry.
You're right, it was.
At least I've heard that. And so the probation department, currently in the county of Los Angeles, the probation department at the county level actually gets those funds and then allocates those funds out.
Okay.
Which, as we've discussed, we're working to try and see if we can really make the connections between the county, particularly in some of our target areas, to start making the connections with the services we do provide so we can link those up with probation to actually try and create a better seamless sort of transition for young people that are coming out of incarceration.
Okay. Now, the grants in the report right now is based on the 07, 08, and 08, 09 grant awards?
We have actually another chart that we've provided for you, the color-coded. I don't know if you received it.
I don't see it.
Okay. Do you have any extra copies, by chance? And that takes you, gives a historical perspective from '05 to future projections
Okay.
for several
What
years.
I think would be healthy for the city and certainly for the mayor's office, because more and more of the attention is going to be drawn toward your office, and more of the questions and concerns or what have you are going to come directly to you now, especially after July 1st. And I think it's important for you to outline with the grants '05 through present and into the projected future of what the balance is of intervention, prevention, suppression, et cetera, so that people can understand that we're actually changing the way we're doing things in the city. For example, GRZs didn't even exist until this fiscal year that we're in right now. But people are going to say, well, what's so different now than in the past?
Sure.
So what we need to start doing is show them, at least categorically, what we've been doing, and then show them what the plans are, what the shifts are, and then to start to explain to them not so much what happened in the past, but what's going to be different is the accountability models, which we're going to go over in a few minutes, et cetera, and then the kind of shift in the way we allocate funds, where they go, how we're deciding as a city where to focus on, and how to be able to explain where those dollars are, what those dollars are addressing, where they're being addressed. And I think it's only natural that we should be wanting to explain what we're doing now and why, but also if anybody says, well, what were you doing before, we should be able to point that out.
Right. And I think, as you know, in the budget proposal for this next year, a little over $24 million. I believe about $5 million of that, as Laura said, is actually coming from these grants. So we're integrating a combination of these kinds of grants and earmarks into then the general fund allocation that we have to create the funding source to really fund our strategy.
Mm-hmm. So basically, when you look at basically July 1st forward, we're going to see a different dynamic when you look at the charts and things of that nature as to the application. So that's what I mean. I want to be able to identify, and for all of us to be able to articulate what we're doing different now. And obviously the whys, et cetera, are going to all unfold. But just like this chart goes all the way back to 05, 06, we should do that as far as categorizing what we did, like you did in the other chart, how much of it is actually suppression, how much of it is intervention, prevention, et cetera. And then also on top of that, I think we're going to constantly have to delineate how much of the intervention prevention even breaks down between those two components as we're better defining that, and as we're actually rolling forward with finally having a definition that we can actually model in the city of Los Angeles and follow. Okay? All right. Now, what we have here, it says GRZ totals. 13,358,000 basically. Now, of these grants, how much of that is applied beyond the GRZs, or how are we meshing that? Why are we identifying them as GRZ identified rather than identifying them in other fashions as far as application of dollars?
I think this chart was actually made for a previous presentation that we had where you had asked for information specifically about how we were funding, using grants in the mayor's office to fund the existing gang reduction zone. So this is really that chart with a little bit of an update as to how we're funding the existing gang reduction youth development zone. So that's what this chart was specifically designed, was to show you, this is the source, say it was the Bureau of Justice Assistance, Target Violent Crime. It was for 77th. here's how much went for suppression, here's how much prevention, intervention, coordination, administration. So we tried to break it up by both grant and then also by where it fell in terms of which particular geographic area that it actually supported.
Okay.
Now, if you
Now-
want something different, we can certainly, move
Well-
the numbers around to show you a different.
One of the things that I need clarification on is we have 8 GRZs that are in the current year.
That's right.
And then we're looking to add
4 more.
4 more.
Yeah.
Yet the chart talks about 07, 08, and then 08, 09. So I'm assuming, or I was assuming till I saw the heading saying 07, 08, 08, 09, that there would be a difference in what we did in 07, 08 versus 08, 09.
Well, I mean, I think we're still in conversation with GRID in terms of the funding development and how we're going to fund those 4 additional zones that have been discussed.
Okay.
But we have funding that will carry us over into 08, 09 because these are multi-year grants. And those are the projections that you see there.
Okay.
And what we
the
did in terms
information.
of preparing the overall budget that we announced, 2 weeks ago, is we looked at all of the funds from the dedicated, from these grants that we're talking about here. How much of those is really going to be available from July 1st of 08 through June 30th of 09? Because some of this has already been spent in the current fiscal year. And then that's the amount that's coming from the dedicated grant sources, and then the rest is coming from the general fund. So that's how we really lined up in terms of determining where those funds were going to come from, and then how much was going to be available for 08 and 9.
Okay.
And some of these grants, as you know, I mean, if you look through there, some of these are like JAG 2006. So even though it was awarded in 2006, it has a 3-year life in terms of our ability to spend it. And so some of this money has actually been awarded there, but that has gone through the processing council and the contract negotiations with the federal government. We're still using funds that were actually awarded, as long ago as 2 years ago.
So how soon can you put a chart together like this, a table together like this, that actually shows the anticipated July 1st
For moving
going
forward.
Yeah.
Well, as soon as after the budget is finalized in council, I think then we would know exactly what we'll have available from the general fund, and then how much we'll have here, and then we could do you're asking, or could we do this same kind of chart for 12 zones? Yeah, we can do that.
Exactly.
I think after the budget, maybe
Soon
a
as the
couple
budget's
weeks after
over.
the budget is finalized, that would be great.
Okay. All right, perfect. Again, there's gonna be contrast, and I think that it's important for us to all be on the same page of understanding what that contrast is, because we're not out of the woods yet with people not believing that we're serious,
Right.
with people not believing that we're actually going to do something different, with people not believing that even this issue can even be taken on and that we can be effective in making a difference. I think that we're not out of the woods. I think that we're going to constantly see interesting reports from the media. We're constantly going to have the community trying to push us to do something, even though unfortunately when people are angry and upset, and certainly upset at the loss of life and things of that nature, they tend to want to tell us to do something.
Right.
And unfortunately, in my opinion, all too often the press picks up on that and tries to make it seem like we're doing nothing. So I think that it's important that we anticipate and are open up to the public about the something that we are doing, or the some things, and then at the same time allow them to understand and see this is what we're doing.
Right.
And we all expect that there's going to be much better fruit of all of this effort in the future because of all of the things that we're pulling together and having a better accountability and a better understanding and a better communication, et cetera. So if we can get that chart, I think it's going to be very, very helpful.
Sure.
When that kind of dialogue and that kind of rhetoric starts flying this way. Okay.
That'd be great.
Sure.
We'll do that.
All right. Okay. Okay. So I think the most relevant thing on this item is that we get that report, and then so that we can actually start to archive whatever we did in the past, and then start to show this is what the concrete effort is going to go forward.
Okay.
And where the funding's coming, where we're putting it, why we're doing it, et cetera. And like I said, on the next item, we're going to cover some of that.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. Okay, any public comment on item number 1?
No.
Okay, I don't see any public comment cards on item number 1. Is anybody here to make comment on item number 1? Seeing and hearing none. Okay. Do you have a card, sir? Okay. You turn it into the clerk. Please take a seat. State your name for the record.
Hi, my name is Stan Mohammed. I am a member of the Venice Neighborhood Council, also an executive director of Venice 2000 and Helper Alliance. My comment is this. Even though this is a decent strategy, unfortunately, in the 11th district, we have noticed that it's not a gang reduction zone, number 1. And there's a great possibility that the services that's being provided to the community could be taken away if the funding does not remain in that district. And I'm hoping yourself and others could really look at the other areas that's not being covered, because when we hear the mayor speak about a citywide approach, how did the west side get left out of this process? And if it's a citywide approach, then it should cover from Venice all the way back down to the east side. And right now, Venice is not a gang reduction zone. And I think it's due in part of the efforts that's been taking place for the past 9 years between the black gangs and the black gangs and Latino gangs in that area. And we have created a ceasefire in that area with B13, with Culver City, with Venice Shoreline in particular. And gang-motivated, gang-related crime is down in the area. And it's unfortunate that the mayor did not pay attention to how that took place. Because if the mayor had paid attention to the violence that was in that area not even 10 years ago, then somebody would have came and knocked on our door and say, look, we need to talk to you guys on how did you create that strategy. So I'm hoping that these other areas don't be left behind when it comes to the funding, because I pay my taxes, and I'm a stakeholder in that district. Thank you.
I need to ask you a question. You're talking about what's going on in that part of Los Angeles. The controller just finished a report. It's funded last summer, and she came out with a report in February of this year. Did her people interview you or any organizations out there that you're aware of? They did not?
No. And I believe if they had did that, they would have seen some strategies that's working. Mm-hmm. You know, we have a policy that when something take place, we have B13s, we have Culver Cities, we have Venice Shoreline. We got these people at the table who have a voice, a reason. There was a murder that took place over at Venice High about a year and a few months ago, last day of school, where a young Latino brother got killed. And it could have created another war. However, because we had the lines to communicate with the key individuals, we was able to prevent a war from taking place. There was one tragedy that took place maybe 2 months later where an African-American male got killed down the street from Venice High, and it was a direct result of what happened to the Latino brother who got killed at Venice High. But in the past, it would have been more than one individual, and that person that got killed was not even a gang member, and there was arrests made on both the murders. But the point I'm making here is nobody took time out to even ask, how did you guys create a ceasefire when one of the biggest wars in the city took place in the 11th district? Nobody took time out, and it's documented. You know, nobody took time out. And now here we got $385,000. We've been maintaining a ceasefire for the past 9 years. And the fear from the neighborhood council is this: if those funds do not stay in the district, what's the possibility of this violence coming back to our doorstep? And this is what I got to hear from the stakeholders as a neighborhood council member. What's the possibility? So I'm just hoping that city council and the mayor will consider increasing that $900,000 that's supposed to be allocated for intervention and making sure that the 11th district is taken care of.
Mm-hmm. Well, another study that was, the controller study was about $500,000, and another study that was approximately a similar amount was done by the Advancement Project, called the
Yeah.
Advancement Project Report. Did they interview
Yes, they
you?
did.
They go through?
Yes.
And did they reflect these things in the report that you
Absolutely.
just said?
You're right. A lot of the information that we gave Connie was definitely reflected, and I can see some of it here when we talk about community intervention. That came from Venice. There was no subject about community intervention. It was always gang prevention. But what we've done in that district is we've been able to deal with the community, because gang violence is not just dealing with gang members. It's dealing with the community. So we're dealing with the senior citizens. We're dealing with individuals who's having issues with graffiti that could come up on their wall, and these are regular stakeholders. So we brought that language into the equation, community intervention. And that came as a result of Connie and her staff coming down there and sitting down with us and talking to us about how are we doing this? What are you guys doing? And we spilled our guts to Connie, and it was in the report.
Okay. And you mentioned $385,000 that you're concerned that might not continue to flow into that community.
Yes.
Who's receiving that money?
We are,
Who's we?
Venice 2000. We are part of the Unity Collaborative, which Toberman Settlement House is the lead agency. We currently have 16 staff members. We provide safe passages at Venice High, and we provide safe passages at Mark Twain Middle School. And we do hardcore intervention in and throughout the district. Now, we also have workers in the 10th district and also in the 8th district. Now, that came as a result of us identifying intervention workers in that area that needed the training that we've been giving them. And so that part, Jefferson Park area, we got people working there. And of course, we know that's a gang reduction zone. And of course, we know we can apply for those monies and probably get a high grade. At the same time, the 11th district is my concern, because those stakeholders is concerned. The neighborhood council members is concerned. There was a letter that went up to the mayor from the neighborhood council, and these people are concerned about the possibility. And the only thing we can share with them is our current reality, is that there is a possibility that those funds will not remain in that district. Now, of course, we're going to apply for the funds, and I'm quite sure we get a good grade. We got some great grant writers, but the fact remains that the mayor, I think, overlooked what we have in place there. And if I had an opportunity to speak to him, I would say that to him.
You do, there.
Well,
I know.
you have his representatives here.
And I've spoken with Jeff, but
Stan and I talk frequently.
yeah, quite a bit. But
So-
that's the concern. It's not. I'm not here to vent, but I'm here as a member of the neighborhood council. We just had a meeting last night as it relates to violence, and we're going to be doing a town hall meeting on this Venice Safe. We have a lot of stakeholders that believe Venice is not safe. And my argument is this: if the intervention services was not in the district, where would we be as it relates to black and brown violence? When we know that the families that is suffering to this day behind murdered family members are still, like going through it. They will not talk to African Americans, and we got African American families who never talk to Latino families. But at the same time, we have an agreement in place. Culver City have agreed not to come and create havoc in Venice. Venice Showline and B13 have agreed not to go over there and create havoc. But there's other gangs in the district that is creating havoc. And we have to stay on top of those gangs at the same time with
And that-
minimum funds.
Part of that $385,000 helps you maintain that peace?
Absolutely.
And one of your main points is that Venice, for example, or the 11th district doesn't geographically have a reduction zone in it.
Yes.
Correct?
And it's due to the current LAPD stats. But if you talk to Deputy Chief Har, who knows what's happening in that area and what done occurred, of course, gang-motivated, gang-related crime is down in that area. But we can't give all the credit to the gang injunctions. We can't give all the credit to LAPD. We have to give credit to the individuals who have the ability to communicate with individuals who can create havoc. And I'm just here as a witness, and I see it, every day of my life, man. When we bring these individuals inside the office, the individuals who don't want to have peace and don't want to have a ceasefire, we have Latino workers and African American workers who have the ability to communicate effectively with these individuals and say, look, this is what we have in place. Please don't disrupt it. We're trying to bring all the Latino sets together now to do a handball tournament at Venice Beach. Handball, first time. The only neighborhood who have not been invited as of yet is Culver City. Culver City, those individuals is bitter. I mean, to the point to where all it takes is one. I told Jeff this the other night. All it takes is one individual to shoot the right person that got the ability to create peace. If one of those individuals gets shot at or even attempted, it's all hell, man.
That's right.
And here we go again. Now I'm gonna have to sit down with Jeff and the mayor and say, okay, well now we need a gang reduction zone.
Yeah.
What I'm trying to say to the city and
Yeah, that's-
city council in particular is look at what we have in place. How did we create it? And what would it take to continue to get, because that's not a lot of money, but what would it take to keep that in place so we won't create another war out here?
Or allow another award.
Absolutely, because it's, and let me say this. It's harder to maintain peace than create it. Because you have to stay on top of the attitudes of these individuals who is coming home from prison, who don't want peace, don't care about what we done created. And if those individuals decide to go against what has been created, all hell could break loose. And then those stakeholders is at risk again. Some of these individuals, you guys know gentrification is live and well in Venice. Big fences is going up. The question is Venice safe? Some people are saying it's not because the gang violence is still here. So I asked Rocky at the mayor's address, I said, do we have a gang problem in Venice? And he said, yes, we do. I said, why don't you tell the mayor that? Because 2 weeks prior, we had ATF in Venice, we had FBI in Venice, we had LAPD in Venice, knocking down doors, 25 families looking for gang members. And one of those homes was my mother. So I'm trying to keep myself calm, but at the same time, I have to think about those who I'm serving as an elected neighborhood council member, man. And it's frightening to know what's happening. I'm not saying the gang reduction zones is not a good strategy, but is it something that's been proven?
Well, the point to the mayor's office that I hear you saying is we have gang reduction zones. It's based on the statistics of what's going on throughout the city and the main hotspots in the city. But how does that strategy apply to a place like Venice where the particular cops on the dots or whatever the chief calls it didn't meet that level of requirement to have a gang reduction zone? And how do we maintain the kind of effort that, for example, $385,000 is trying to assist with in Venice?
Well, first of all, Stan knows I respect him and Venice 2000 greatly. We've had numerous conversations about this.
No, he mentioned it.
I would say a few things. Number one is, I mean, we did, we were able to, or we've proposed to take the funds that we just talked about in terms of those grants, and we've made a proposal that will be debated right now, actually maybe right now, in the budget hearings and with the council in terms of how much from the general fund. We've proposed an increase in that to try and increase some of the funds available for this. We have made a decision that we think that the areas where right now we have the greatest levels of violence, that as we've said before, that are actually on average, the gang reduction zones, the 12 areas we've focused on average are 4 times more violent than the rest of the city on a whole. And we feel like that is an important way to use that data to make decisions about where we allocate our resources, because we do have communities who really are in crisis in terms of the violence that they're experiencing. And just so we're clear about the kinds of violent gang crimes we used, we're talking about homicides, aggravated assaults, which would be with a weapon. You would have used some sort of weapon, robberies and rapes. So we were talking about pretty violent gang-related crimes. So it wasn't like, extortion or something that is bad, but, a little different kind of a crime. So I think that's the decision we made, and our proposal was put forth based on that to try and really impact and saturate these neighborhoods, not only with the suppression through the CLEAR initiative and on the coordinated law enforcement side, but to also invest prevention and intervention dollars. As we've stated publicly $1 million for prevention and $500,000 for intervention in each one of those areas.
But
Now-
how does that either bleed over or
Right, we
apply
did-
to places outside?
We have allocated, as Stan said, another $2.4 million in our strategy for the areas outside the gang reduction zones. $1.5 million for prevention and $900,000 for intervention. And we are actually encouraging folks who are outside those gang reduction zones to actually apply for those funds and to make a case for those. And I've said, and I would suggest, that there could be different kinds of cases made for those dollars outside the gang reduction zones. One case that could be made would be to say, you know what, most of our gang reduction zones are anywhere from 6 to 10, on average, police reporting districts in size. So there's clusters of violence that we've evaluated by looking at the data. But someone might be able to say, you know what, there are 1 or 2 or 3 police reporting districts, not maybe enough of a cluster of violence to justify a gang reduction zone, but there's a smaller cluster of violence that actually deserves some attention and some investment to try and reduce the levels of violence there. Someone could also make a case, like Stan is making, he wrote half his proposal here, I think, in terms of saying, you know what, if we look back historically, in terms of building the case, we've looked back historically at levels of violence, and we look at what has happened in this particular area, and we look at the investment the city has made through gang intervention work or whatever that, and here's our case for why there ought to continue to be some sort of investment in these areas to try and actually maintain the peace or to actually reduce the current levels of violence, which are less than maybe what they've been in the past, to actually drive them down even further. That would be a legitimate way to make the case for why those funds are needed in your particular community. I think the important thing is that we are saying with all these funds that we need to have a fair and competitive process, that we would not set aside funds where we would say, well, we're going to maintain this group or we're going to maintain that group, that we have said in this city from this point forward, what we want to do is to take whatever funds we've cobbled together from these various sources that we've now proposed, and we are going to set forth a comprehensive strategy. We've decided to have a geographically targeted approach, primarily with allowances for some of those outside of that area. But then we're going to have a competitive process for 2 primary sources of funds. One is for prevention, to actually reduce the numbers of young people who are actually joining gangs, because I believe, and I think most of the people in this city believe, as well as the experts, that the only way we will ever get out in front of this problem in the long term is if we shut off the supply of young people who actually are joining gangs. And so that's where we're very focused on the prevention. We will have a assessment tool that we'll use to actually look at the risk factors specific to gang joining. And on the intervention side, we are suggesting that we need to do 3 primary things. We need to utilize folks like Stan and other folks who have been doing this work for a long time. And we need to invest in them, and we need to do 3 primary things: to interrupt the violence. When these shootings start pinging back and forth, as Stan said, exactly what he's talking about, what he's done and other groups are doing, is exactly what we need. When the first shooting, you may not be able to stop the first shooting, but you sure as heck want to stop the second, third, fourth, and fifth. And that's what these guys have done a great job of, and we need to help them do more.
But that's the thing that never gets quantified. And I made
And
that
that's what we're
statement.
working to do.
Yeah, it's the crime that did not happen.
right.
We don't have stats on keeping the 2, 3, and 4, the retaliation from happening. That's what we don't know.
And then the second-
And that's what we're worried about.
And the second thing I think we want them to do is actually do the proactive peacemaking, which is what Stan is talking about, is to really try and proactively make peace and maintain peace. And then the third thing is to really make the connections in terms of folks who are coming out of prison and out of the jails, in terms of helping them reintegrate back into the community in a more productive way.
Oh, they're going to reintegrate.
Yeah, well, reintegrate and hopefully move in a positive direction, as opposed to the current system where we have 70% of them who reoffend in the course of 2 years by the time they are released. We're trying to move them in a positive, different direction. So Stan and I think we are friends now. We're going to be friends no matter what. We're going to work together. But we have a different approach in terms of how we think, and a strategy on how we ought to do this. And we're looking at using the limited funds that we have right now. If at some point those funds grow in subsequent budgets, or if they grew in this budget somehow miraculously, we would certainly look at how we could both deepen the work we have in these existing zones, as well as expand the areas in which we do that. And there might be some funding mechanisms in the future that might allow for something like that.
Here's the concern.
But based on what we anticipate today, as proposals are floating around the city of Los Angeles, come July 1st in the new fiscal year, there will be an opportunity for Venice to continue to receive funds to address the issues. I said opportunity,
That's right.
not like the old days where you say, well, you've been doing this for years, here's your money.
I think it's also important for people to understand too, though, the primary funding source in the city of Los Angeles for this kind of work has been the LA Bridges Program 1 and 2, which has been funded through the Community Development Department. We have proposed ending that, but allowing a 6-month transition period for all the agencies. So I believe Venice 2000 and some of these other groups are actually presently funded through Bridges 1 and 2. Those funds will be extended for 6 months, from July 1st to December 31st. That funding will continue at relatively the same level. We're working on the budgets for that right now, but essentially we're trying to maintain funding levels as they are pretty close to right now.
So Toberman would,
All the groups that are presently funded through LA Bridges will continue as is, as close to that as possible, through December 31st. Our plan is to actually then conduct this RFQ process for intervention, request for qualifications, as well as a subsequent request for proposals for the intervention dollars sometime this fall, so that then our plan and hope would be that we could have the competitive process. If we can have the help of council in moving this very quickly through council after we make subsequent recommendations, our goal would be to try and have new contracts in place for both intervention and prevention in the gang reduction youth development zones, as well as for the areas outside of the grid zones by January 1st of 2009. So for the groups that are successful in applying for the new funds, there would in essence be, hopefully a fairly seamless transition in terms of the funding, because I recognize that if an organization is doing a good job, we don't want to penalize them and actually have them lay off staff and then rehire them. That's, run an agency, that just doesn't work.
okay. Just on that issue, one of the problems we've had currently is that the bridges contracts were somehow out of sync with the city's fiscal year. And so we always had this emergency, we had to introduce emergency motions to get these people paid.
Yeah. Right.
It sounds like maybe you can address on whether or not we've corrected that problem.
Well,
Although it sounds like maybe you're going to still get into this.
you are mixing primarily through, we're mixing this set of grants that we talked about prior to you here, in terms from the mayor's office, about $5 million that comes from a number of different sources that we're using those funds. Then secondarily, there is about $900,000 that comes through the consolidated plan, which of course runs on a April 1st through March 31st funding cycle. And then the rest of the funds are the general fund, which clearly run on our typical July 1 to June 30th funding cycle. So we are trying to move the contractors into a regular cycle of getting contracts and awards on a regular 12-month cycle. And then sort of behind the scenes, we're going to do our best to figure out how we manage the funding cycles of these other sources to ensure that we have the money to support those various areas.
That's been a real problem.
It has been a problem, and we're going to
it's a
try
problem
and
now, currently.
we're going to try and move that forward
Okay.
in a different way.
Mark, this is my concern. $900,000 for the city. It's not no money. And everything that you just said, Jeff, is something that we do. In regards to reentry, the first place these individuals come is to our office. Now, if we don't have the resources in place to direct this individual, just yesterday, and I got it right in my conscious mind, he comes in, he's been gone for 8 years, former Crip, sits down, we're doing a resume for the man. Now, hopefully we can refer him to a job place. But if the resources is not there, we got to close the office, the guy comes home, Venice 2000 is not in place, well, I'm going to go back on the block and sell some dope. I'm going to get back into this lifestyle. I see it's an opening for me because I got a voice, so I'm going to sew the hood up because I had it before I went to jail. So that's the biggest concern. Like, if the resources is not in place, then how can we even help unless we ask these 16 people to volunteer? And that's not going to happen because everybody got to take care of their families. The other concern is gang prevention does not have a request for qualification. So now we got a wide open window for individuals who don't have a clue on how to deal with this population when it comes to gang members or potential gang members. So you got this wide open window because we did not institute a request for qualifications for the gang prevention piece. So you probably can have anybody that have a nonprofit to apply for those funds. What I would hope can happen, and I hope it's not too late, that we institute a request for qualification for both, well, gang intervention is already in thanks to Howard Hewlett and a few others, but for the gang prevention piece, I was at the meeting last week. These people don't have a clue on how to deal with this population. And we're going to end up in the same situation again with the funds. We heard it with the clergy the other night. Money's coming to the community, but it leaves the community because the people don't know how to serve the population. So is it possible that we can create or have a discussion about is it even necessary to have a request for qualification for gang prevention? Because you got some big mega agencies out there that look great on paper who would get this money, but guess what? That population is not being served probably because they don't know how to deal with the population. So can that, and I'm done. And thank you for your time. And I'm hoping everything is being recorded because you will be hearing from me. And before I bring out 100 people, I want to first try to create a decent relationship with the mayor and everybody else that's controlling my tax dollar. Because I'm hearing about the money, but I pay taxes. And I'll be damned if I'm going to sit here and just let it go and say, well, my tax dollar is finna go into other parts of the city when the 11th district is not being served. So thank you for your time.
Thank you.
But hopefully our RFQ can come into play for gang prevention. And
Okay.
thank you, sir. All right.
Thank you.
Appreciate you.
Okay, anybody else here for public comment on item number 1? Okay, seeing and hearing none, public comment on item number 1 is now closed. We'll now move to item number 2.
Item number 2, Mayor's Office to make a presentation in connection with the proposed consolidation of the city's gang prevention, intervention, youth development programs and related matters. Discussion item.
Okay.
Well, I think you got about, you just got about 2/3 of my presentation in the Q&A time there, but basically the mayor's office has made a proposal that we announced a little over 2 weeks ago now to actually consolidate a number of different functions and programs into the mayor's office to support our gang reduction youth development strategy, building on what we have already had this year. We've proposed a total of 12 gang reduction youth development zones. Those zones, actually the maps for those are on our website. There's essentially 2 in the San Fernando Valley. There are 4 in the central, northeast, and east part of the city, and there are 6 in South Los Angeles. And we've proposed that we would put $1.5 million in each one of 11 of those for prevention intervention, $1 million for prevention, $500,000 for intervention in each one. And in the Rampart Zone, which is a much more densely populated part of the city, we have decided to allocate $2 million for prevention and intervention in that particular targeted area. Each one of those areas will also have the supporting law enforcement portion as well, which is coming outside of our particular proposed a little over $24 million budget. We will also, as part of that budget, we will be, as we said, allowing for $2.4 million for prevention and intervention outside of the 12 gang reduction youth development zones. We've also allocated funds, just under $1 million for an evaluation, to actually have an outside evaluation that will be conducted of the work that we're doing. Is that a fire alarm?
No, air in the lines.
Along with to support an intervention academy that we're working with Councilman Cardenas and others who are working to put together an intervention academy to really help provide the kind of support and training and certification process for our gang intervention workers. We would actually, as I mentioned before, allow for a 6-month transition phase for the LA Bridges programs, which would allow us to have 6 months to be able to phase in the work to hire the additional staff we'll need for those particular areas, as well as conduct the RFQ and the RFP process so that we can actually hopefully get the funds out by January of 2009. We're going to focus on two primary things, as I said. Prevention and really focusing on the young people who are actually most at risk of becoming involved in gangs. And at the initial RFP that we put out for the 6 areas that we just recently conducted needs assessments and resource mappings for, we've been very clear in naming 6 primary risk factors related to gang joining that the researchers have identified. We will also, we're in the process of developing with them an assessment tool to really assess those risk factors, and then to be able to use that instrument for ongoing reassessments to see if we're actually reducing the number of risk factors.
Who's developing that?
It's a combination of research folks from USC, from UC Irvine, from UCLA, Northridge, and we'll having, pardon?
Dr. Georgia Leap, she works.
Georgia Leap's a part of that, Malcolm Klein, Karen Hennigan, Cheryl Maxon. I mean, we're fortunate to have some of the top researchers in the country on this issue in our backyard to help us with this. And then, as I mentioned on the intervention side, we'll be really looking at focusing who are the active gangs in these particular target areas, asking the intervention groups to actually focus on the violence interruption, the proactive peacemaking, and the reintegration or reentry into those areas, and to really target on who those active gangs are in those areas, to develop a strategic plan for engagement on an annual basis, and to really work with law enforcement to really kind of create the communication mechanisms and the protocols for how they work together in an appropriate way for both sides to be able to try and create the kind of connections that we need to try and drive the violence down in these particular targeted neighborhoods. We've also proposed a gang reduction youth development cabinet that would pull together key departments to be able to start doing a better job of coordinating our work, whether that be Rec and Parks, the Community Development Department, other departments, to really try and get those departments to identify what they can contribute in terms of trying to reduce the levels of violence. Great example of this yesterday, the Workforce Investment Board, as part of the workforce development system run through the Community Development Department, I believe actually passed as part of their annual plan, a 10% target for all of the workforce centers this next year is to actually serve ex-convicts or gang-affiliated young people through the workforce centers. And then our office is going to be actually working with them to actually develop the referral system so that we can figure out how to determine that those young people actually are gang-affiliated or ex-convicts, and then a tracking system to see if they actually hit that goal. We'd like to begin to find other ways through various city departments that we can build in those kinds of targets and those metrics, and then really focus the departments to see how their work can also support in this. And then the last thing we're proposing in our plan is to actually to look at how we develop a strategic framework for the next consolidated plan. Because if you look at a lot of the stuff that was actually outlined in the controller's report, much of it was related to the consolidated plan for the community development block grant funds. And what we'd like to do is look at the human service delivery system there and really work with the department and others in the city to see how we could develop some key priorities for how we could have a coherent human services delivery system throughout the city, not to sweep those funds into the gang reduction zones, but to see how we create the right networks and ensure that we're getting the best leverage of those dollars to support ancillary functions, whether that be case management or it be additional kinds of supports that the gang reduction youth development zones and the organizations working in there could plug into receiving those services, similar to the way we're doing with the workforce development system as well. So that's in a sort of the Reader's Digest version of what we're proposing moving forward.
Okay, that's a great example of or explanation of what the anticipated service delivery is and the model, active model. Once we are in place, let's step back a second. There's going to be a transition. What's the mayor's office's transition plan when it comes to the centralization of prevention and intervention being run out of the mayor's office, and the primary delivery was coming out of the CDD. Now, what is the plan for making sure that that transition happens? There's going to be a lot of staff that are either going to go and do other things. Some staff are obviously going to be hired in the mayor's office. Some may come from CDDs. Some are coming from wherever the mayor decides to hire them from. what's the plan there? Is there a plan? And I want to know what's going to be the transition between CDD and the mayor's office when it comes to those logistics.
We've been in, we're actually currently in conversations with the Community Development Department to develop a more detailed plan, but in general, this is what we've agreed on so far, that actually the Community Development Department will actually work on renegotiating the contracts for the existing LA Bridges 1 and 2 contractors, and to actually get all of those agreements and the service requirements and stuff for those particular grants and the grant award amounts in place and finished before the end of this fiscal year, and get those into the city attorney's office and do all the requirements to get those contracts executed. What we've then agreed to do is that effective July 1st, for that final 6 months, our office will actually monitor those contracts. And so we'll be working with them during the contract negotiation phase, but then we'll monitor those contracts. As we had earlier on the previous item, the mayor's office has a Homeland Security and Public Safety grants administration team. We'll be using some of the supports there with them, and we're also in the process of looking to hire folks to help fill some of those functions, although many of these positions that'll just be part of what they do. It's not an exact one-for-one position split. So we expect that we'll manage those grants over the course of the next 6 months, and then, as I said, those would end December 31st of this year.
Now, basically, in this process, it's inherent by moving programs like Bridges 1 and 2 away from CDD and creating the new dynamic within the mayor's office. We're going from a department to an elected office. Do you feel confident and comfortable that all of the potential dynamics and snags have been identified, or are you in the process of doing that? And if you are, who's involved in identifying the logistics, the kinds of things that could cause delays, or the kinds of things that could somehow impede the timeline that you anticipate?
Well, we have a couple staff in our office, in my office and in the mayor's office, who are working on that. I actually don't see a problem with it going from the Community Development Department to the mayor's office in terms of it being a political office. We actually already administer some juvenile justice grants, some domestic violence grants out of the mayor's office, and we contract with them in a very similar way that the Community Development Department would with contract with them. So I don't perceive there to be any problems in that. I mean, we're setting up a system, and I think, in fact, the 6 months, what we'll be doing with those contracts in the bridges in terms of how we monitor those will be similar to what we'll do moving forward. So I don't see any problems inherent in that process. I mean, there certainly might be some bumps along the way, but we're trying to smooth those out as much as we possibly can to have a smooth transition.
So you're basically answering my next question, which has to do with, do you have any concerns related to operations or personnel or program-related transition closeout processes, snags that you anticipate? So you feel as though, obviously, like you said, maybe bumps in the road, but you feel confident and comfortable that those have been identified to date? Yeah,
we had a good conversation. I was not in part of the meeting, but with what's the name of it? The Executive Oversight Committee, I think. Administrative Oversight Committee, and the city attorney actually had some questions about the closeout for the LA Bridges for those 6 months, and so that's one of the things we're addressing with the Community Development Department in terms of how they can continue to maybe provide some technical assistance for those closeout grants at the end of December, because these will, as we said, those extend for 6 months. But we know that we need to work through those issues, and we've identified those. Okay, my next question is, who's going to be handling the closeout? Because a lot of the administrative staff 6 months down the road aren't going to be existing in CDD, I anticipate, for these particular programs. Is it going to be the mayor's office that does the closeout? Our plan is we'll do that. We'll be handling the closeout, and the folks who will be managing those 6-month contracts for the final 6 months will actually do the closeout. We might just have some technical assistance from the Community Development Department in terms of the history, because this is, I believe, almost 11 years old in terms of this program. So you have some agencies that have been funded likely for that entire 11 years. And we have to look at things like, did the city buy, property and equipment and things like that hasn't been appropriately depreciated out and things like that. So we'll be looking at that. Mm-hmm. And they're trying, as I understand it, they're trying to identify some of that stuff up front, even now in the sort of pre-negotiating phase for the last 6-month contracts.
Okay. Now, the mayor's office, your office indicates that $3 million in funding for the GRYD zones is subject to the availability of funding from the city's general fund and various state and federal grants. So that is in flux at this point in time, and we anticipate at the end of the budget process, then that clarity will be solidified?
Yeah, I mean, we had to have a disclaimer in there to protect us from, we had to get through the budget process and make sure everything's, some of those funds we already have identified, they're through these these state and federal grants that we have.
Speaking of private, is there any safety net if there's any shortfall or what have you, or is it just a matter of cutting back 100,000 in this category per GRYD? Is it cutting back on 100,000 on that other category? And then if that's the case, obviously the expectation outcomes are going to have to be adjusted as well, I presume.
Yeah, I mean, we're not looking to supplement the vast majority of what we're doing here with any private funds, but we are actually working on raising some additional private funds. So, for example, the needs assessments that will need to be conducted for the new areas, we're in the process of trying to secure the funds for that. We've also been looking at expanding this next summer an idea that was done, I believe, about three or 4 years ago in the 10th district called Summer of Success, in terms of looking at this idea of extending the hours and expanding the programming at parks. And we're in the process of identifying some of the parks in the gang reduction zones that we have presently, and then how we could actually do that and target those areas from the July 1st July 4th through September 1st this summer, and use that as a galvanizing event, and using private dollars to do that. We're also working with the researchers to help them identify some potential private funding sources specifically for this assessment tool, in terms of we're going to pilot that, but they would like to really, because there's nothing like this actually anywhere else in the country, there's only delinquency assessment tools, to pilot this here and really study this and use our gang reduction zones as a laboratory to try and enhance and really fine-tune that assessment tool to ensure that it actually is really targeting those risk factors that really do identify most closely with gang joining. So there's a number of efforts we're working to try and generate additional private funds to support other things, either directly impacted by this or outside of the work we're doing, because there is a lot of interest. The good thing right now is there's a heightened interest and awareness around the city, and we're trying to encourage that and take advantage of that.
What's the notification process for program participants and agencies that are going to be affected by this reorganization? I said participants and agencies. Talking to agencies doesn't necessarily mean that somebody's talking to the constituents about how to receive these services and where they should go next if particular doorways have changed from this side of the street to that side of the street when it comes to the next generation of how we're going to implement services.
Right. About a week and a half ago, the Community Development Department actually convened a meeting of all the current LA Bridges service
1 and 2?
Providers, 1 and 2. They were all invited to attend a meeting, and actually I spoke at that meeting to talk about our larger plan and then also to talk about the 6-month transition. We've also, I believe the Community Development Department is going to be sending a letter in writing to the 27 middle schools and the district where some of the current prevention programs are actually presently housed. There's some are on campuses and some are in the community in the catchment areas of those schools, to notify them. And then as part of the final 6-month contract for LA Bridges 1 and 2, the agencies will have to articulate a transition plan for any clients that they would have and how they'll actually transition those clients to other services. And the Community Development Department has identified and looking to try and help them make the connections to, say, Neighborhood Action Program funded, other CDD funded agencies and programs that would be in those areas to help them make that transition as well.
So the actual participants in the long run, once the RFQs go out and the RFPs are done for intervention and prevention, et cetera, if there's a shift in who the providers are in certain communities for our constituents, it's going to be up to the providers going out and the providers coming in to do that notification or that dialogue?
Well, assuming that we're talking about serving the same kids, I mean, I think what, particularly on the prevention side, what we're suggesting is that now this new assessment tool that really is identifying the primary risk factors related to gang joining, which we've not used before previously, will be the screen in which we'll use to determine the eligibility, that and, obviously where they live and things like that. But specifically, that's what we'll be using to identify for moving forward after January 1st in this new prevention model, to really target those young people who are most at risk of joining gangs. So I think we're talking about if there are some current young people who that assessment would be given to, and they are identified as having the risk factors unique to gang joining, obviously we would want to make a transition for those young people first. But if there's a young person who actually is in a current Bridges program but is not assessed to have those risk factors, then I think we would want to refer them to another kind of program that's going to be different than the one that we're proposing moving forward.
Okay. Now, when it comes to, as was presented in item number 1, it's inherent that there's going to be grant dollars involved in the GRYDs, and anytime the city inadvertently doesn't comply or is told after the fact that those grant funds weren't used appropriately or what have you, then we tend to turn to the general fund. Everybody knows what the general fund conditions are right now.
Right.
What is the mayor's office going to be doing to make sure that we are on top of that and that we don't find ourselves in that situation?
Well, I think we have a grant administration team presently in the Homeland Security and Public Safety that's administering those grants, that's very familiar with the requirements of those grants. Those have been shared with our staff in terms of being clear what the expectations are, what the requirements are with those particular grants. We track those in our office separately in terms of the whatever the requirements are related to that. And we've not used funds that we don't believe the funding source is allowable. And in fact, even when we're awarded, typically we're awarded a grant based on the proposal we wrote, then there's a contract negotiation process in terms of where we would negotiate with the funding source the particulars about our budget based on, because often the grant award might be less than what was actually requested in the first place, to really be clear about what we plan to use those funds for. So, and I think presently, in speaking to our R.F. Alakon, our Deputy Mayor for Homeland Security and Public Safety, in multi-millions of grant dollars on the Homeland Security Public Safety side. I think last year we gave back like $800 that we weren't able to expend. So I think our in the mayor's office are very cognizant of trying to maximize the use of those funds and make sure we spend every penny of those, so we don't have to return any to the existing funding source.
So bottom line is, with the experience under RF's team, you feel confident you have the staff there to interact with and make sure that we're generating the services as we need to comply with all of the grant funding.
And I think our plan is to continue to be aggressive in actually seeking those funds. We've got one grant writer in Homeland Security and Public Safety, and we're looking at actually having a grant writer on our team to really focus on the prevention and intervention side of things, to try and get more funds to come into the city so we can aggressively go after every dollar that's available out there and bring that into the city for these to fund these programs.
Okay. Can you outline for us what the anticipated grant funds, what the source is when we're going from an identified 17 million or so to the 20 million in services? You mentioned earlier that there's about 5 million-ish or several $1 million.
Yeah, there's about 5 million in grants and contracts. I think we've outlined, that's in the previous document there, the various sources from justice assistance to Bureau of Justice's justice assistance grants. We have some money from the CalGRIP grant in the state. So there's a variety of sources like that. Some of those are formulaic grants that actually there's the formula, we can apply for those or actually allocate, write a plan for those in a proposal, and we get those based on the formulaic, particularly some of the ones from the federal government. And so we would continue to go after those. Actually, when I was in Washington in March, meeting with our congressional delegation, specifically asking them to see if we could get the federal government to actually, in some of those cases, those formulaic grants, to increase the amounts of money available in those formulaic grants, because actually Los Angeles often benefits from those particular formulaic grants because of our population here in the city. So we'll continue to do that. We also, our office has worked with a number of our legislators to put in requests for projects related to the funding of these programs. We'll continue to do that aggressively.
Now, when it comes to the RFP for prevention services, how is the mayor's office going to be engaging with the local council offices and the representation there when it comes to finalizing that process?
Well, all of our, we have a review committee that's made up, every one of these will make a series of recommendations in terms of who will fund for prevention and intervention eventually. And then those will actually, I would assume those may come here to ad hoc, or they may come to here in budget and finance, but ultimately all of those will actually come through the council for approval, is my understanding. I mean, we can certainly, as a courtesy, once we've made our recommendations for the zones that would be in a council office, we certainly would be willing to share with those before we just bring them through some committee process as well.
Yeah, and I want to make it clear that what you just described does not violate any of the process.
Yeah.
I don't want anybody to assume that what you just, I want it to be clear that what you just described has to do with courtesy and a dialogue.
Right.
It doesn't have to do with the actual process before you.
That's right. Yeah, we have an independent review panel. Someone asked at the bidders conference if they could know who those people were. We said absolutely not. So we've got representatives from 5 different kinds of representative. We'll have someone from the city, but obviously not from a council office, from our office. Actually, we'd originally talked about possibly the chief administrative officer, CLA's office. Our city attorney advised against that, to actually have just someone from a various city departments. So we've identified about a half a dozen kinds of departments. We'll have someone who's an expert from like a research kind of academic expert, a community person, someone from law enforcement, and actually someone from education. And we're putting together review panels for each of the gang reduction, the 6 that we're doing right now, and we'll do the same for the subsequent.
But when you fund an organization, it's up to them to hire the intervention workers.
Oh, yeah. No, what we would,
We don't
No.
hire intervention workers.
we don't hire intervention
When the
workers.
city council approves this funding, we're not specifically
No.
hiring intervention workers.
Yeah, if you're relating to an intervention, when we get to the intervention portion of these RFQs and then the RFP, we would actually, those $500,000 that are available, they would be through a competitive proposal process and a review process. Then recommendations we've made to the city council, just like any other contracts that go through, those would be approved by the entire city council, not just any individual council member. And then those...
Not specific.
That's right. Then those agencies, they would be 501c3 corporations and agencies who would then actually make their own hiring decisions about who they hire. They would have their own standards for hiring. And in fact, we're working particularly with a number of the intervention organizations, and we'll be working with this committee to identify things like code of conduct, hiring protocols, and things like that for intervention, to really kind of put in the kind of safeguards we want to ensure that we're getting the best people in this field, and we have appropriate safeguards for that.
When do we anticipate the RFQ and or RFP to be released when it comes to intervention? And what kind of interaction or dialogue in the development of that is going to occur between the mayor's office and the council?
Well, as you know, we're working on the request for qualification process. We're going to work with the ad hoc committee in terms of developing some of the suggested what those qualifications might be. We're looking at a 3-pronged qualification process that we would try and qualify intervention organizations based on fiscal management capacity would be one kind of qualification. A second qualification would be for wraparound services around the 2-pronged definition, and then another qualification would be for the hardcore street gang outreach. And so we will work with the committee to develop those kind of broader principles, and then our office would actually plan on developing the RFQ. We'll issue that RFQ, and obviously we would want the RFQ process will happen prior to the request for proposal, which would happen subsequently, and any agencies who are approved through the RFQ process and qualified would be then the agencies who actually can apply for the subsequent funds through the RFP
What would be the
process.
ideal timeline based on what is going to occur July 1st, what we anticipate and we all expect we should be able to effectuate by July 1st, 09, 6 months later? It's
08, you mean? Oh, January 1st.
January 1st.
Yeah, I would hope the RFQ for intervention, I would hope we could issue that this summer because we'd like to,
summer, right?
because we'd like to conduct that process, and then obviously that would be followed up by the RFP process, which we hope to have able to go sometime in the fall.
But
to be able to
meanwhile,
do
the
that.
intervention funding is in place.
It's all in
Yeah,
place
through-
for 6
through
months.
December 31st. Now,
Yes, ma'am.
The whole idea is if we can overlap all of the requirements and expectations and timelines, then there will not be any interruption of service. Obviously, there's going to be a change in the way service is delivered come January 1st, and some faces may change, some organizations may change, but the bottom line is, as far as a gap in service, we don't anticipate that there'll be a gap in service.
Well, I think on the intervention side, I mean, we are talking about a substantial change, so I wouldn't want to de-emphasize the fact that we may not only have different agencies, but we're really talking about targeting a very specific audience, which is the young people 10 to 15 years old who are demonstrating the risks related to gang joining. On the intervention side, there's probably a little more continuity in terms of the kinds of things that a lot of the groups are doing. You know, some of the groups may be doing all the things we've suggested moving forward in terms of violence interruption, proactive peacemaking, and integrating from reentry. Some maybe do some of those things, not all of them. We obviously will be moving forward looking for people to do have a consistency across the city in terms of intervention.
What about, are we talking about the same number? What are we talking about in terms of numbers of intervention?
Well, I think, you know, that's one of the things we'll be talking about in terms of the request for qualifications, the request for proposals. I mean, we're allocating certain amounts of dollars in each of these targeted areas. I think the question could be, we could have a conversation about, do we want to be prescriptive in terms of this has to fund a minimum of, you know, X, number of hardcore street gang intervention workers, X amount has to go to wraparound services, or leave that up to the proposers to say, look, for us to do the primary things that you've outlined in terms of an intervention strategy, here's what we propose, and here's how we propose spending those funds to address the issues that you've outlined in the proposal. You could take a multiple approach, and I think that's the kind of thing we're going to have a conversation about.
Exactly, and also, one of the things that needs to be understood, I think that everybody who's involved in having their hand in the RFP, RFQ process for the intervention, RFP, RFQ, are very cognizant of the fact that there's going to be a lot of input on how it should be developed, but also everybody understands that there's certain phases of that process where certain hands cannot and will not be involved.
Exactly.
So that we don't taint the process.
That's right.
But I think for the first time, what we're going to do, at least on the intervention RFQ and then RFP, is we're actually going to have a well-rounded, well-thought-out street-level input on what it takes to have an effective relationship between the funder and the street-level providers. And the thing is, one thing I want to point out, people shouldn't be surprised that people who eventually are going to be, organizations that are eventually going to be submitting to the RFQ, RFP process will have given their opinions about what it should look like and what it takes to actually do the work so that we can actually design an RFP, RFQ that actually will work. People, they do that all the time in this city, in this county, in the state, in the country when it comes to, for example, RFPs and RFQs for construction, which bricks and mortar.
Right.
Same thing. They hire and say, build us a building. Somebody's building a building right across the street from City Hall for hundreds of millions of dollars. And they went through a process. But even the engineers and the bricks and mortar folk who actually create those dialogue with the community that actually knows how to get the work done before they actually create the RFP or the RFQ.
Exactly.
And the fact of the matter is, I don't think the city's ever done that on the service provider end like we're going to see it happen this time.
Well, I'd like to think that's some of what we did on the prevention
Yeah.
RFP that we just did.
But
And we
what
want
I'm
to do the
saying
same thing
is
on the intervention.
That's part of the new paradigm.
Exactly.
Okay?
Yeah.
The RFP, RFQ process that we're doing today, even though Bridges has been around for over a decade, Bridges 1 and then Bridges 2, I don't think they actually did that front-end work like we're doing now.
Yeah, I'd like to think that we actually we did reach out to folks and try and get some input, and also previous to this job, I spent a lot of years, almost 20 years, actually applying for those things, and I'm hopeful that some of my experience and background and having been on the other side of that equation, I'm trying to make that a process that's more user-friendly for folks who are running agencies, having been somebody who ran an agency and knows what it was like to actually apply for those funds.
I was just going to get back to the number thing, though. I think at some point, we're going to need to be able to, in some way, talk about this level of service from intervention workers. I mean, we talk about having 61 now, and there's kind of a consensus that we should have more of that. So it's a little vague to me in this new process, whether or not you leave it up to the organization to say, well, with this money, we're going to fund this many intervention, this much wraparound. I still feel like we need to be able to have some kind of a understanding of what this new strategy will translate to in terms of actual numbers of intervention workers. Is it going to be less? Is it going to be more?
I think there's
No, never less.
I don't know. I don't feel that I know that for sure right now.
Well, I mean, I think if you're comparing,
After December 31st.
if you're comparing present level of funding for LA Bridges
Right.
2, which is the intervention,
Right.
which is about $3.5 million,
Right.
and you compare it to what we're proposing,
Right.
assuming it goes through the budget, which is $6.9 million, I mean, it's almost double the amount of money.
Okay.
Now, I think there's been a conversation that's been had about the idea of
Or
both.
also, you're also taking that number and expecting it to be used for, as you say, wraparound services.
Right, for the two-pronged definition, when we talk about
Right.
intervention, we're
Right.
agreeing and supporting the
Okay,
two-pronged
maybe I'm
definition
talking-
of.
okay, how about the first prong, the
Hardcore?
the hardcore?
Well, I think what we've done at this point is allocate the $6.9 million for intervention for the whole thing, for the
Okay.
two-pronged definition. I think one of the conversations that has occurred, which I agree with, is the idea of increasing the number of intervention workers, as well as there's been some concern, I think rightly so, about are we actually adequately paying the existing workers enough to make sure that they have an adequate living wage, they get health benefits,
Yeah.
insurance, retirement, and stuff like that. So I would think moving forward, we would want to balance both those priorities of raising sort of the standards, the professionalism of the groups, i.e. training and investing in them in terms of training, also looking at ensuring that we are paying people a living wage so that they can actually take care of themselves, with the idea of seeing if we can actually increase the number of intervention workers and particularly ensure that we reduce the levels of violence in these targeted areas. So I think, I mean, I'm open. I hope you hear me saying I'm open to saying how we can balance that. We can either, I mean, you have two choices in RFP. You can be prescriptive,
Yeah.
or you can leave it up to the experts
Well,
who are applying for the
it's
funds,
true,
or a
except for-
combination of both.
It's true, except for it's part of what I was assuming that with you in place and the mayor's office, that you would develop this comprehensive strategy for really citywide on reducing gang violence.
Uh-huh.
So it seems to me someone's going to have to say, I'm thinking we need X amount, literally by number, X amount of number of hardcore intervention
In
workers
each one of
in
these
this
areas.
particular
Yeah.
zone. Somebody's going to have to say that.
We're prepared to make a decision. I
Yeah.
think what we've been wanting to do is to have this conversation rather than just
Yeah.
make some decision
Because
in a
frankly,
vacuum.
when I look at a 6.9 million, when you're talking about increasing wages and benefits,
Well, it's still not enough. I mean,
yeah.
when you look
and
at,
part of that money being used for wraparound services, I think we're either going to be about the same of the hardcore or less. And
Well,
yeah.
I don't know
okay.
that that's necessarily
Okay.
true. I
We're-
don't think
okay.
we've made
But the
that
thing is-
decision.
Okay.
Yeah.
Jan-
But
Jan-
we haven't said, like, we're going to take I mean, we've not made a decision to say, for example, we're going to take and split that
Right.
500,000, half for hardcore street gang, prong one,
Right.
and half for prong two. We're not suggesting that. I mean, actually, to be honest with you, the prong two, the wraparound services,
Right.
I think what it would behoove the city to figure out how we would use any resources we have in that particular portion to leverage other resources, because
Right.
the reality is there are other jurisdictions that have, millions and millions of dollars for exactly those kinds of services. What I think we all would do is figure out how we use some of our funds to leverage those resources, whether it be for probation, whether it be from, the
County
Department of
health.
Mental Health, so various different county departments, as opposed to just saying, well, we're going to, use all that money for whether it was, tattoo removal or whatever you wanted, whichever one, cognitive behavioral therapy or whatever. I think we want to try and leverage that as much as we possibly can. And that's the conversation we're going to have. Is the best way to do that to be more prescriptive in a proposal, an RFP process, or to give the agencies the ability to make that decision and say, this is what we want to happen in terms of intervention in these targeted areas. You tell us how you're going to accomplish these outcomes.
Because they're the ones that are going to be held accountable.
They're going to be the ones that are going to be held accountable. And so, I'm a little hesitant to just say, well, you know what, you got to have 6, because in a particular neighborhood, it may take 3 in this particular neighborhood
And-
to do the
and-
work. It may take 10, depending on.
Exactly, and the gang
know.
interventionists are so dynamic and is so different from one community to the next.
Right.
You could have a network of interventionists in one part of the community that are doing an incredible job, and there might be 5 of them. And you might go on the other side of town, and geographically, it might even be a bigger area.
Right.
And you only have 2, and they're able to maintain it. Should we leave it at that? I don't think so. In both of those examples, I can guarantee you they're spread thin.
Sure.
But at the same time, there's no question that as a society, we've been underfunding intervention to the tune of 1 to 100, 1 to 1,000 when it comes to the same resources to that community. When you start to pile on what I call the suppression and the back end investment or waste, when you talk about how many city attorneys do we have in our city attorney department, how many DAs do we have addressing the issues in the city of Los Angeles? How many probation officers do we have? How many sheriffs? How many police officers, et cetera? When you start to add all that up, it's not $3.5 million covering the geographic area of Los Angeles. It's in the billions.
Absolutely.
So there's absolutely no question whatsoever that we have it's almost to the point of ignoring the appropriate resources necessary to properly fund intervention in this city. And the sad truth of the matter is, how much can we blame ourselves when we don't even have an example or a model anywhere in the country? We have duplicate models throughout the country when it comes to funding DAs, yes. Funding city attorneys, yes. Funding police departments, sheriff's departments, et cetera, yes. Having raids when the feds want to come in and make an example and do press conferences, we have those examples all over the place. As a matter of fact, you can actually have the feds come into the city of Los Angeles and in a matter of weeks spend more money and resources in those few weeks than we're dedicating to intervention throughout the entire year. So there's no question, Janice, there's no question. And the reason why I'm making my point in that way is I don't want to get into it about how we're underfunding it to that point. What I want to do is we're going to step by step show that we're going to do what little we can with the resources that we have right now. Hopefully we are at 6.9 million finally.
I'm sure you all will help us with that process.
More than we've ever done before, but that's not the end.
Yeah.
That's once again, we're still scratching the surface. But what we have to prove to the people in the community of Los Angeles, and we have the opportunity to do, is finally create a model that is the basis and the foundation for expansion, which may someday mean 69 million, or 100 million, or 250 million. And the irony of all this is, if we start doing that, I can guarantee you, and this meeting is being taped, I can guarantee you, if we get to the point where we're funding intervention and prevention, and also intervention specifically, front-end work, we will reduce the $10 billion budget of state dollars going into the incarceration system. Which, when I was in the legislature creating the Schiff Cardenas Act back then, my figure was $5 billion. And then a couple years later, when I left the legislature, just in a couple years, we crossed the $6 billion mark. I just found out through one of my former staffers who does this kind of work, we are now at $10 billion in funding the incarceration system in the state of California. My point is, if we actually get to the point where we can prove, which I think we're in the process of doing right now, that intervention and prevention works, and it's a lot less expensive, then what we're going to see is the curtailing of the need for dollars in the billions on other activities consuming our taxpayer dollars. And then hopefully we'll be able to shift and actually fortify those funds in the front end, and then as a result, there'll be more money to fortify our communities for education, for healthcare, for all these other things. Because when it comes to incarcerating people, it's a runaway train. When it comes to dollars, it is a runaway train.
Here, here. You're not gonna, I agree with that.
The next question I have is, what's the plans to, are there, or what are the plans to incorporate the Fdns in the mayor's gang reduction strategy?
Well, I think that's the family development networks are actually funded through the consolidated plan for the community development block grant funds, and that's what I made reference to. We're looking in the next year, we're looking at a strategic framework for the human service delivery system, which they're a part, and how to ensure that that system provides, sort of general prevention and support, that the gang reduction youth development zone folks could plug into those as well. So there's no decision that's been made at this point as to any specific thing related to the family development networks. But we would certainly want the agencies where there are family development networks that are doing work in, say, a gang reduction zone, we would certainly want to link up with those organizations to try and coordinate their work with the work that's being done.
Is there an anticipated timeline for pulling together what you just described, and or is there going to be some type of procurement process, or how formal is that?
Well, the
likely going to be
our office, the person in our office who actually works on the consolidated plan has actually already initiated a conversation with the community development department about this idea of developing a strategic framework for the human service delivery system. The consolidated plan, as I understand it, typically comes out around November-ish, December, January?
January.
Okay. In terms of the initial plan, and then it goes through process, and then actually, gets usually voted, I believe, in March, so that it can start on April 1st. So what we're trying to do is come up with, we're working between now and when that comes out to say, what are these are the 3 priorities for the human service delivery system, and this is how we'd like to design a human service delivery system going forward, and then we would talk about that through the whole process of the consolidated plan conversation.
So again, that's another overlay activity.
Yeah. That we're working on, ongoing to try and do that going forward.
Okay. Now, according to the controller's report, gang intervention and prevention and reentry programs lack evaluation criteria. What's the mayor's office doing to evaluate the programs and the overall strategy going forward?
I think we're really looking at 2 macro outcomes. One would be obviously to reduce, as I said earlier, to reduce the number of young people who are actually joining gangs. And so by targeting the young people who are exhibiting those risk factors, we hope to actually build in the protective factors to stop those young people from joining gangs. I think on the intervention side, we'd really be looking at reducing the levels of violence in those particular communities, as well as gang members who are actually extricating from the gangs. And we're actually working with we're going to be working with this a research group, to give us some of those indicators, because there's certainly individual indicators that, in terms of an individual and the decisions they make, or their risk of protective factors. But we're also looking, are there other community indicators that we could try and look at in terms of outcomes? Like, for example, could we have a community safety plan in place in every single gang reduction youth development zone that's in partnership with the local schools to ensure that kids are getting to and from school safely? That could be an indicator of an outcome that we would hope to achieve in these zones. So those are the kinds of things we're actually looking for, both in the specifics of individuals for prevention and intervention, as well as more of the macro community indicators that we would hope to see as well.
Okay. The current controller sure did make it clear and repeated many times formally in committees like this and before the council and before the press that to move these programs under the jurisdiction of the mayor's office and away from departments would include her I don't want to say evaluations. She specifically said audits, performance audits. Has the mayor's office already set the timelines for the controller and the expectation and understanding through the motion of the council that actually forwarded that authority to her? Because there was, whether people like it or not, there was some ambiguity, and the city attorney said even if people don't agree with the city attorney or not, that the controller, when it comes to performance audits, needs extra permission to do that. That permission was provided in a motion that also included the movement of these services under the jurisdiction of the mayor's office. That's all been done, acknowledged by the mayor's office formally, et cetera, through the appropriate process. But I want to know, is she dialoguing? Is the current controller dialoguing with the mayor's office and trying to set up that timeline?
Yeah, my understanding is we're talking about a 6-month timeline for the next 18 months, and I had an initial conversation with the controller recently where she talked about that. So we fully expect that, and are looking forward to working with her to give her the information to see the progress we're making. Obviously, probably the first 6-month evaluation is going to be really focused more on, are we actually able to implement the transition and do some of those particular functions? But yeah, we're happy to work with her and plan on working with her, and
yeah, I
we've
fully
already started that
anticipate
conversation.
Each one is going to have a different character of what they're looking at,
Right.
and what they're reporting on, because there's going to be a massive transition
Right.
period, and then there's going to be implementation on the full-fledged new system, et cetera. So I anticipate the flavor will be different of what she's going to be evaluating in those performance audits as the dynamics change into a much more robust new structure, which we've been discussing for the last hour and a half.
Right.
But what seems a bit odd is I'm not on the budget committee, but the controller pointed out to the budget committee of the council that she doesn't have funding to do the performance audits on this particular matter. Again, you welcoming that and working on a timeline is one thing, but for that other entity to preliminarily already say, just almost days since we've actually approved this new paradigm, basically expressing that perhaps that's not going to take place. She said she'll do evaluations, but performance audits and evaluations are two different things.
Yeah, I wasn't obviously in the budget hearing where she.
Yeah, I wasn't either. I
Yeah.
heard from somebody else, and I said, no, that can't be. And then my staff verified it, and I verified it. So my point to you is, I don't control what the controller does. You don't
Nor do
control
I.
what the controller
Yeah.
does. I anticipated one of two things happening, being that she was so emphatic about it, being that she did in fact express that directly to the mayor's office. She expressed it in committees. She expressed it in press conferences. Matter of fact, she expressed it in a press conference, the very first press conference on her report, standing next to the mayor. And the mayor said that he supports the report, and she made that one of her main points that she wanted to articulate. And yet, just weeks later, it appears that willingness or effort on her part may have diminished a little bit. I just want to confirm with the mayor's office. The mayor's office still does understand that was part of the process.
Absolutely.
And that the mayor's office welcomes that.
Yeah, absolutely. We're committed to that. Yep.
Okay, thank you, because I just wanted to make sure that nothing else has occurred since that emphatic exclamation on behalf of the controller, and then that little twist in one of the council processes just recently, just in the last few days. Good. So then I'll talk to the controller about consistency there. Now, when it comes to how do you plan to incorporate the input and participation of the community into the overall strategy?
Well, I think
We're talking to each other, but none of us are going to be successful in the streets when it comes to implementation unless we have good communications with people on the streets, our constituents.
Well, I think certainly we have been talking to people for the last 9 months since I've been here. We'll continue to talk to people in the community.
Can you give us some examples of some of those
I've been
forums and/or
I've been to forums with the Watts Gang Task Force and the Harbor Gateway Task Force. I've been to meet with groups of intervention workers, with groups of clergy. I've actually sat down with groups of young people, some of them gang members, talked to individual neighborhood councils. So I've talked to agency directors or groups of agencies who are nonprofits who work in these areas. So I've talked to a number of different folks, and we'll continue to do that. I think in terms of a more formal process, we will actually, in each one of our plan, which we've done in Boyle Heights, in each one of the gang reduction youth development zones, we'll actually formulate a couple of groups. One will be sort of a community engagement group in each one of those target areas, as well as that would make up a variety of stakeholders in that community, from residents to business owners to law enforcement, schools, various folks from the community who are stakeholders, as well as then a multidisciplinary team who's really focused, the agencies. And so we're looking at the law enforcement, intervention workers, the prevention providers, referral sources for the young people who would be coming for either who are at risk of joining gangs or actually active gang members, to really see how we get that multidisciplinary team to really function around really targeting and working with the young people who are at risk of joining gangs or active gang members. So we'll have two various functions like that in each one of these target areas to specifically engage the community in that effort.
So to date, you and/or the mayor's office has been communicating with community leaders, organizations, service providers who are already involved in these issues, directly with constituents, and obviously with, I'm assuming you didn't mention city departments, but obviously city departments all relevant and involved in these matters.
I mean, I haven't hit every single community in every single part of the city.
But the thing is, the communication is ongoing, and then there's going to be continued informal communication.
Sure.
As issues occur. In addition to that, formalizing new ways in which the community can come together and communicate with the mayor's office.
Yeah, I see this as a dynamic problem. I mean, if I think back about where things were in this city in terms of this issue of youth violence and gangs 15 to 20 years ago, I think it's there are certainly some things that are consistent with the way they were 15, 20 years ago, but there's things that are very different now. And I think what's happening on the streets is very dynamic, and in communities are constantly in transition and changing, and young people themselves are being influenced by a variety of different factors around them. I would think that there would need to be, I believe there needs to be an ongoing conversation about that, because what's going on is going to actually change. And if we're not in dialogue about that with what's going on in local communities and the changing dynamics there, if we're not constantly reflecting on the work we're doing, evaluating that, and determining whether or not what we're doing is actually working, and then find out what we're doing that's not working and make adjustments around that, we'll create just some sort of static. I don't want us to create some new thing right now that would we would have implemented by January 1st at least the beginning of it, and then have that just be the static thing that goes forward for the next 5 years or 10 years or whatever. I would hope that whatever we put in motion is something that will be an organic sort of model that will actually adjust and change as the issues change as well. That's my goal.
Okay. Now, how do you plan on working with the council to ensure that the legislative and programmatic processes are all in order?
Well, I think certainly we have agreed we would come and give regular status updates to the council. We're certainly happy to do that. There'll be some sort of annual, when we approve the contracts for the providers, that will actually go through council process, as well as the annual budget process, where we propose in the budget process what we would do. We certainly plan on working with individual council offices. Once we've actually, got contractors in place, we've created these multidisciplinary teams. I would assume the council offices in any targeted area in terms of where we have a gang reduction youth development zone, we would want to have the council officer because they have obviously field staff who are very familiar with the community. In fact, in the zones we've created already, I feel like we've got a good working relationship with our program managers in those targeted areas, are working very closely with the council offices to make sure we're working together, because sometimes constituents, will work different sides of the equation, and we want to make sure we give as a city a united front in terms of what we're trying to accomplish, and that the community understands that the mayor's office and the council office are working together to accomplish our purposes in that area.
In prior discussions, we spoke about the need to consolidate the GRYD cabinet and the team of managers outlined in the motion, which was seconded by the council president and other members of the council. That being the case, have you decided how you're going to do that? And if so, when do you anticipate convening those meetings?
I think we're still looking at the sort of what we want the primary focus of the Gang Reduction Youth Development Cabinet to be, as well as the other group that you mentioned that was in the motion. And I hope we'll be able to convene those in the next 30 to 60 days. Obviously, right now, we're pretty busy trying to get through this RFP process to get all the other transition issues related to bridges and hiring staff and things like that. But we certainly want to do that because I believe the coordination process in terms of getting the various departments to start working towards a common agenda is certainly an important thing.
Mm-hmm. I think that's something that unfortunately I think the press would see kind of like as a bureaucratic process, another group of folks meeting, another group of high-level people meeting together and talking. That group is not going to be talking. That group is going to actually be part of the strategy and the thinking process through how do we implement this new process and what are the technical things that we need to identify to make sure it goes smoothly, and also some of the dynamics of how do you get a mayor and an entire council and departments and then the community all on a similar page. I don't want to dare say same page, but on a similar page of understanding, and then culminating in everybody being able to say, I understand what's going on in my community, and for the city to be able to say, we understand why we're doing certain things the way we're doing it. And like you just described a few minutes ago, I think that's going to be a big part of that
Sure.
dynamic living process that we're going to have to be making changes on. I hope that we don't find ourselves making major changes here and there, but certainly I expect that all of us understand that we're constantly going to be making changes because, again, we don't have a model to go by.
Right.
No, Chicago hasn't done it. New York hasn't done it. Houston hasn't. Nobody's done that. El Salvador, Germany, I mean, every part of the world has issues with youth and juvenile issues and juvenile justice issues or what have you, but this is totally different. This is on a scale that we haven't done it before, so I think that group isn't a bureaucratic get-together. I think it's part of what we need to do to keep ourselves on the path and keep ourselves open to understanding that I don't want to dare say we're going to make mistakes. That's not the point.
Right.
I don't think we're making mistakes. I think we're making progress. I think we're actually creating something that's actually going to make a bigger difference than it's ever done before. So that group is critical for us, even people like me and you specifically, and the mayor and the council and department heads, et cetera, to understand that this is the way we're going to do this. We have to do it right.
Right. I agree.
Okay. One of the things that we've talked about a lot, and we've talked, you and I have actually acknowledged this in these committee hearings, and we've actually discussed it privately as well. And that is that the city of Los Angeles has never really afforded our third-party providers the resources necessary for them to develop and understand how to participate in true evaluation and dialogue and feedback, and ultimately for improvement, and also verification that the services are being provided. Right. In this RFP process for the prevention, and I anticipate in the RFQ and RFP process for intervention, we definitely are going to provide that. since the prevention RFP has already been introduced, is that provided in there?
Yeah, we actually show the, in the RFP, we actually describe the outcomes that we're looking for. There's some primary and secondary outcomes. And then what we've asked agencies or bidders to do is actually to set aside 5% of that budget specifically for data collection. And what we're working with this idea of the evaluation framework is to determine what are the things that we want to measure, and then work with the nonprofits that we'll actually select to determine the data that we want to actually collect, so that we'll have that data available for the evaluators. But we certainly see that being a dynamic process. Once we select the providers, our goal is to have the evaluators on board very quickly as well, so that we can sit down with the providers. They're very clear expectations about what data they need to collect, what are we going to be evaluating, so there's a clear understanding of what we're doing, and it'll be a conversation about that process.
I think one of the I'm going to call it a flaw that we've incorporated mainly with CDD, and I say we, the policymakers in the city, is we expected that CDD would go ahead and report back and evaluate providers, third-party providers, and what's going on in the streets, but they're their programs. So in a sense, if they find that there's in their evaluations that there's they're coming up short, in a sense, they're having to report that they're criticizing themselves.
Well, I think there's two different things. One is,
how are we going to avoid that? Do you agree that we should avoid that? And if so, how are we going to avoid that with this much more robust and aggressive and appropriate evaluation as we've all been talking about? Well, and the word is accountability. We've always said that we don't have the accountability that we should have in these programs. And what part of everything that we've talked about today is inherent in the fact that we've all committed to having a better accountability system.
Well, I think one thing is I would argue that mostly what we've done is contract compliance. I mean, so
exactly.
We develop
which is people need to understand. That's basic.
And
that's not dynamic. That's real simple.
Right. And we'll continue to do that. I mean, here's your contract. Here's what you agreed to.
Yeah, that shouldn't go away.
We're going to pay. We'll continue to do contract compliance. What we're trying to do now is to say, well, there's an independent evaluation to say, are we meeting these larger goals that we have for this effort? And those will be independent people. It's not the analyst or the policy analyst who's actually managing that contract, who's coming out and looking at you and seeing if that's having the impact of the work. We're trying to get some outside folks who will really look at this from a more macro perspective.
But also an independent perspective.
Yeah, from an independent perspective.
Reporting, not going
here's
out there
what we
to
saw.
be a stick and beat the organizations over the head, but also to let them know and be dynamic with them and let them know, the information you gave us isn't what we need. We need this information. You follow what I'm saying?
Yeah, and I also think, I would hope that we'll learn, something is working, say, in one particular targeted area, and it's not working the same in the other target area. Why is that? Is that because it's a different context? I mean, I hope the purpose of the evaluation is to learn, so that we find out what's working in one particular area, and we find out, is that because of the uniqueness of the personnel? Is it because of the uniqueness of the context? They have a different situation in that particular community, why it works better there as opposed to the different community. I would hope the evaluators are going to be able to tell us that, so then we can say, well, actually these have similar context. It really is the provider is doing this differently in this particular area, which is why it's working over there. Well, we should take that learning and say to maybe a provider in another area where it's not having the same kind of success, and say, you might want to try and implement some of these kinds of particular practices that this group has actually implemented, and they seem to be getting better results, so that we can actually get the kind of impact across the board that we would hope. Because it will be uneven, because we'll have different folks doing different approaches, and we would hope that we would learn from that over time, and then dial in the good stuff and
now when you say we, you're talking about the provider, the city,
and the evaluators,
everybody in between.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I think, again, that's different than contract compliance. I mean, if you don't fulfill your contract, there are appropriate sanctions and processes for you to either maintain your contract or to lose your contract. That's very different than saying, well, we're trying to now evaluate the qualitative and the quantitative results of the work that we hope to achieve. Now, if somebody over time, we've evaluated over and over, we've given them recommendations from experts about how they can adjust what they're doing, and they don't want to make those adjustments, or they can't seem to make those adjustments, and we've provided them kind of technical assistance that they should need to make those adjustments, then I don't think we ought to just keep continuing to give them funds forever. I think
Now,
we ought to.
inherent in what is being developed, you do feel comfortable that there's resources to help them, like you just described?
Yeah, I think we're looking at some training, for example, on the assessment tool that we're using for prevention. We've actually got built into the assessment tool, the development of the assessment tool, a manual for that assessment tool, as well as a training that we'll actually have for everyone who's actually receiving funds for prevention, for how to actually use and implement that assessment tool.
But if they have questions, et cetera, there's going to be plenty of...
Yeah, we'll have people in our office who can help with that. I think the other thing is we even talked about, there may be, over time, we might want to look like, could we, if we want to do a different kind of case management model with this, can we provide, would we provide some training for all of the organizations around case management, things like that. I would also think over time we would identify from the agencies themselves, these are the kinds of things they could use training for, so we would want to actually, provide that kind of training.
Now,
And
I
think I'm being called to the budget committee to probably give a similar, it looks like.
What I am down to my last question.
Okay.
How many youth are you expecting to serve in each one of the GRZs?
On the prevention side, we've actually identified a minimum for the first $500,000. We've asked them to serve a minimum of 100 young people. And if we, as we roll this out, some of these all these communities will be investing $1 million. We would expect that to double, so we would serve a minimum of 200 young people in the course of a year around prevention. We've not, as you know, we're still working on the intervention metrics and things like that, so we haven't come up with a number like that, but certainly we'll put that into the proposal as we move forward.
One of the hardest things to evaluate, unlike the police department, they have a certain number of hours that the police are on the street, they're patrolling, they handcuff a certain number of people, make a certain number of arrests so they can quantify that. But how are we getting toward the point where we feel comfortable, or you feel comfortable, in how you're going to evaluate how many kids don't join gangs or how many kids leave gangs?
Well, that's on the prevention side, that's what we've identified these risk factors in this assessment tool. We'll use this to get a baseline at the beginning to determine whether or not they meet the threshold. And then we've looked at, we've suggested in the RFP that at 6 months and 12 months, they reapply that assessment or re-administer that assessment tool to see if actually then we've reduced the risk factors or built in protective factors in the life of that particular young people. And then the other thing that's important, we've actually in the RFP said, that the contractors will have to have a minimum of 3 face-to-face contacts with the young person on a weekly basis, and at least minimum of 1 contact a month with the parent or guardian or person who's in that role on an annual basis, because we believe the dosage, and according to the experts, that the dosage, that face-to-face contact, whether that's a therapy session, it's engagement in some sort of recreational or artistic activity, a pro-social youth-centered activity, or it's in multi-family systemic therapy session, that really it's that consistent face-to-face contact with the positive intervention in that young person's life, as well as the life of their parent, that they believe is part of how you reduce those risk factors and actually start to build in the protective factors. So we've tried to be fairly prescriptive in the prevention RFP without being so prescriptive that we don't recognize the uniqueness of particular communities, as well as giving the service providers the ability to come up with some creative means by which they would do that. And hopefully we'll get some folks that will try something out here and some other folks that will try something else, and as we said, we evaluate, we'll figure out who's got the best ideas, because this is all, as you said, pioneering sort of new ground.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's the last of my questions for the mayor's office. Thank you very much, Jeff. We do have a public comment card. Stan Mohammed on item 2. just in time. In case you didn't hear, Jeff Carr is going to make presentation to the Budget Committee on this matter, so
Yeah.
he had to go downstairs to the Budget Committee. Go ahead.
Well, I'll be real brief. I was listening and I heard Janice mention how many workers are 61 current. And notice for sure that you cannot put all the gang intervention workers that's currently being paid by the city into the GRZs. It's impossible. For one reason, if the individuals don't have the license to operate, then they're not going to be able to travel to certain parts of the city. And I just wanted to make that point. That's it.
Yes, thank you. I think that I certainly understand that. I would never pretend to be an interventionist. I value my life too much, and I don't mean that being an interventionist that I would get killed. It's just the fact of the matter is it's such a specialized, delicate, dynamic job of being a true hardcore interventionist that unless somebody knows in their heart and in their mind that they are qualified and they have that street credibility, first of all, they're not going to be effective, and secondly, they're just going to put themselves in jeopardy. No matter how big a heart they have or no matter how much they want to help, it is such specialized work, and it is so dynamic and in the sense of having street credibility. If you don't have that street credibility, it can actually create a bad scene,
Yeah.
both for the person trying to help and the people they're trying to help. If somebody has street credibility in Venice, doesn't mean they do or don't have any out there in Watts.
Right.
Maybe somebody does, but only that person knows, and the community recognizes which ones do.
Yeah.
So for a government to try to, any level of government entity to try to say, oh, no, you're an interventionist, you've got credibility, your credentials are fine, and then say, well, if you're in Venice, why don't you go on over to Pacoima and, do some hardcore intervention work there. It's whoever asks somebody to do that doesn't understand they don't understand what interventionists do.
Well, I'm beginning to pick that up from my guy here. I'm beginning to pick it up.
What do you mean beginning to pick it up?
The language. When she mentioned how many interventions is going to be an increase or decrease, it was never answered. But there would be intervention workers in these GRZs. It could be more, it could be less. Well, if you have a neighborhood that only require 2 intervention workers, how could you put 4 intervention workers in that area and then 2 of them is not from that area? So it's almost impossible. And then if you get intervention workers who's not qualified but have the ability to really intervene and they need training, so it's, it's just not setting good.
But the thing, Mohammed, that we all need to understand is, up until this point, we haven't been fortifying that community of workers with the proper resources.
You're right.
So if we're going to increase the resources, forget about the GRZs for a minute. If we're going to increase the resources, then we have to provide the mechanisms for us to appropriately grow the number of interventionists that we're willing to fund. And the sad truth is there are interventionists out there who've never been funded by the city of Los Angeles,
You're right.
although they're working in the city of Los Angeles.
You're right.
So the question for us is, are we willing to incorporate them formally in our efforts with your tax dollars?
Mm-hmm.
And if we do, we can't just do it by saying, okay, we're going to fund 100 interventionists come January 1st of 2009. Again, if anybody said that, I would be concerned. Mm-hmm. I think you would be concerned.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
Because you don't just go out and get interventionists. And the sad
Right.
reality is you can go and educate somebody to be a teacher. A certain amount of time, certain amount of classes, to get a certain credential, then they're teachers. The system recognizes them as a credentialed teacher. When it comes to interventionists, it's not like that.
You're right.
No matter how many classes you can give somebody, no matter how much money you may want to give them, it doesn't mean that they have the street credibility or the license to do the job. meaning the street license, which is unwritten. It doesn't come with a diploma. It doesn't have a seal. It just is or isn't.
Yeah.
So the fact of the matter is, there's that gray area where the city of Los Angeles is now committing itself to doing more intervention work within the city, funding more intervention work within the city. And where the city cannot and will not create true street licensed, street credible intervention people. They will grow within the community on their own. The only thing that we can do, and we anticipate what we will do, is we will complement that with some other formal processes that we hope that all the interventionists are willing to come and be a part of, like an academy, like the kinds of things that we could teach them about. Unfortunately, we're gonna have to teach them about how to fill out forms and how to deal with the bureaucracy.
Yeah.
We're gonna have to teach them as individuals and or organizations how to do that. We're also gonna have to teach them how to understand that there's a different paradigm. They can't just be one-dimensional in saying, I've got street credibility like nobody else, and not be able to communicate at other levels with bureaucrats, with
Right.
their own agencies, et cetera. I mean, there was an incredibly, in my opinion, misguided few minutes of try not to call it news, but that was on television last night.
Yeah.
And the closing statement, I don't even want to repeat it. The closing statement by that I don't want to call him a reporter. The closing statement by the person who did the piece was completely irresponsible. The closing statement was completely irresponsible. And they were talking about intervention workers, they were talking about intervention programs, they were talking about that same issue we've been talking about, most of what we've been talking about for the last 2 hours. And yet, I think that person doesn't even understand what they're talking about. Yet, most people who saw that, and I anticipate there's going to be probably newspaper articles feeding off of that. There's going to be dialogue feeding off of that, radio personalities feeding off of that. And the sad part about it is there was more intellectual and honest dialogue in this committee over the last 2 hours on the same matter of intervention in the city of Los Angeles than was in the few minutes on television last night. Yet those few minutes on television are unfortunately probably going to drive dialogue, and hopefully it will not drive policy, but it may even infiltrate policy in this city. If I were you, I'd be as concerned about what you are or are not hearing here in this committee or from the mayor's office or the council members in this city. I would probably be as concerned, if not more concerned, over those few minutes last night when it comes to intervention work than I would be about the last 2 hours in this committee.
Yeah.
Even though, to me, there was a lot more honesty and intellect and knowledge being dialogued here on intervention in this committee than was in the few minutes that was on TV last night.
Yeah.
Yet, there's probably going to be more activity resulting, unfortunately, bad activity resulting from those few minutes on television than the last 2 hours in this committee.
Yeah. Appreciate you.
Did you see that?
Yeah.
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 Just in general, did you feel that was more on the side of being misguided, or was it
Yeah.
actually realistic and telling
I
the
think
picture?
it was deliberately done because I think the council person have a goal in mind. I think I heard it last year about dealing with the tax situation that helped finance this work. So I think it's a hidden hand attached to it that's going to impact what the council person really want to do to help the whole community, intervention community in particular.
I think you're right.
Yeah, that's what I got out of it. Yeah.
And the sad part about it is, with the lack of truth and the lack of reality, it's just truly a lack of reality that was reported last night
Yeah.
in that piece, is unfortunately going to have an impact on what we can and will do proactively as a city.
Yeah.
Not based on truth, but based on misconceptions and misconstrued and exaggerated facts.
Yeah. Well, I know Bill Rosenthal is going to need your help, just a voice, to make sure that what we're doing in that district stays in place as one of his colleagues. I just spoke with him, that's why I left to speak to him. So,
Are you an interventionist?
yeah, hardcore,
Personal?
yeah.
Hardcore
Started off as a hardcore gang intervention, 14 years from prison. Been home for 14 years. And my goal was to identify the individuals that I used to bang with and sell drugs with and say, look, this is what I want to do. Do y'all want to get out with? This was 9 years ago when we started the organization. And it was 4 of them that said, yeah, let's do it. We had no prior knowledge on CBOs. We had no prior knowledge on community engagement and community organizing. But we had a desire to get back to that area where we was once a detriment. And here it is 9 years later. So yes.
So,
And if I didn't have the license to operate, then those 4 individuals that I identified who were still active wouldn't have never came and said, man, I want to get out with you. And now these guys is taking care of their families, and you probably met one of them, Melvin in particular, but taking care of their families, engaging in dialogue. I mean, it's a lot of things happening with these individuals, including myself.
there was an ignorant statement made at the very end of that piece last night, and basically it talked about you personally. It didn't say your name, but it basically said that all gang interventionists are active gang members.
Because look what happened.
No, hold on a second. I want to clarify something. That statement last night, the closing statement in that piece was that statement. I wish I had it verbatim, but in a nutshell, that's what the person said.
Yeah.
All active all active interventionists in this city are active gang members. You just said on the record of this committee that you are an interventionist today,
Yes, sir.
correct?
Certified.
So basically, that person was talking about you and other people, but that person was talking about you. Are you an active gang member?
No. Gave up the life probably 6 months into my incarceration. 6 months into my incarceration, I was still actively involved in my mind. But after 6 months, I realized one thing that had to change in my life is when I get out, I can't go back to that lifestyle at all because I was looking at a lot of time.
And you're saying you did not go back to that lifestyle?
Absolutely not.
And then you chose a different lifestyle?
And what I chose
And
was,
that lifestyle for you includes not being an active gang member?
Absolutely.
And that lifestyle for you includes actually becoming an effective interventionist?
Absolutely.
And as an effective interventionist, rather than creating crime and mayhem and things of that nature, as an active, effective interventionist, you have actually reduced crime, mayhem, and gang activity in your community?
dramatically. And I also identified other individuals who was creating havoc. And it's all from a spiritual standpoint. I gave them my spirit. I said, look, enough is enough. Even though it's still violence, even though it's still gangs there, but I was able to identify other individuals because we're dealing with tiers when we're dealing with neighborhoods. You may have 1, 2, 3, 4 tiers. So if you get the leadership from each tier to participate in something that's positive, then you affect the whole neighborhood. And that's what done happened in Venice. We done identified the leadership of the tiers. And we've been able to affect every so-called subset, because every neighborhood got subsets. Little homie, baby gangster crip, tiny insanes, infant insanes. We got stuff going on from that age. So if you identify the leadership, which I did in 1999. Now, these individuals could have said, no, Stan, I'm cool. I'm still out here doing it. I don't want to get out. But I gave them a period to transition. It was 90 days. I said, look, God will take care of you, man. And their testimonies can be heard. I'm hoping we can bring them down and they can say it, but I said, God will take care of you because he's taking care of me. My family was involved. I had family members deeply involved in the black market as well as the gangs. So I had to overcome that force when I came home. And I said no, because the only person that took care of me when I was locked up was my mother. So that reality kicked in after 6 months of being incarcerated in Lompoc. And when I came home, even though it was a heavy test for me and a heavy trial, I chose not to get involved at all. So now what done happened is I done been elected to the neighborhood council, 3rd year, ex-gang member, ex-drug dealer, ex-convict. I'm a community organizer. Everybody knows what's going on in the area because of the work that we're doing. We're constantly doing some type of event to honor those who's been killed to violence. But I don't take the credit because there's a whole group of us. And I thank God that these individuals came on board because they could have said, no, you by yourself. You've been gone. I don't know what you're talking about, but you're on your own. But God intervened in their life. Now these individuals is doing the same work that I'm doing.
You know, one of the things, I was insulted by that piece last night, and I was insulted for all of the good, honest interventionists like yourself. But it just amazes me that in this country, we as Americans, and our citizens or residents or people who participate in the society, that we can see a piece like that and your average American will just eat it up and believe it. And someone like you, who is actually willing to be honest about where you were, and actually give testimony about where you were and where you are. And I have every reason to believe that you're being honest and truthful. I know you to be that. Yet at the same time, there are people in this same country, in this same community of Los Angeles, for example. There's a man who was a white-collar criminal who affected the lives by absconding and cheating people out of billions of dollars. And he went to Club Fed for a while, and he is now back in the community, and he is seen as an upstanding citizen today, and who actually has a foundation and has people of every high stature showing him respect and deference. And if somebody were to say something bad about him today, there would probably be an outcry. Mm-hmm. Even though, truth be told, he was convicted of affecting thousands of lives and cheating individuals and families and seniors and people who are living on that money and now have nothing. Mm-hmm. Some people have had heart attacks because of it. Some people have killed themselves because of the way this person has affected them. Yet at the same time, he is allowed to continue his life and go about his business because he has changed. I have no reason to believe that he hasn't changed. But yet, our society accepts people being derogatory toward you, but we wouldn't even accept or even a piece on somebody like him trying to say something derogatory about him wouldn't be on television.
Yeah. We have became desensitized as a people, black and brown in particular. We became desensitized toward the murder. We then became desensitized toward incarceration. You know, I have a brother that's up in Folsom. When I go visit him, the only people in the visiting room, the majority, 98% Latino and African American, and 98% is females. So what done happened is the family structure has been broken. So we, like a young African American get killed, it don't hit the news because the media know that half the people ain't gonna even pay attention to it. And it's sad, but this is something that we gotta deal with. We done became desensitized, and so.
Well, worse than that, Mohammed, what I'm talking about is the attacks.
Yeah.
The attacks on individuals, the attacks on communities, the attacks on people who actually are speaking truthfully and saying, that was my life. That is no longer my life. And not only am I going to get my life straightened out, and I'm going to live a life of not being violent, of not committing crimes, I'm going to commit myself to actually preventing and intervening today and in the future to prevent those kinds of activities amongst people within my own community.
Yeah.
And I'm willing to stay in that community and endure that environment because I'm that committed.
Yeah, and it's hard, especially where I'm at, because when I came home, the residue was heavy. I mean, when with the murders, man, with the violence, with the black and brown tension that was in the area, it was heavy. So any talk about, let's see if we can have a conversation with Culver City, let's see if we can have a conversation with Santa Monica. No, that's how heavy it was. Although I had to have patience because I was locked up when the murders was and the violence was going down, but I was getting letters from individuals on how thick it was. People could not walk the streets. My mother couldn't walk without having a gun on her. And she's 70-something years old. This is how worse, that's how bad it was in that area. So all along, the minute we got the funding, we knew we had to integrate the services. We knew we had to integrate intervention. So the first thing I did was identify an individual who was no longer in that lifestyle, who was working and taking care of his family, a Latino in particular. And we brought him into the office and we interviewed him. He said, look, I would love to get involved. And we put him on the payroll. Even though he kept his job at the market, but he was doing intervention. And we would lean on him whenever there was some graffiti, whenever there was a fight, we would lean on this individual. And what he would do is say, okay, hold on, let me bring the young homies to the table, the B-13s in particular. Let me get them in here. Y'all get the show lines in here and let's talk about it. Now, if we didn't have that individual, we wouldn't have had access to the Latino youngsters at all, because the residue was still there. And that's what I don't think the mayor realizes, that we're dealing with residue behind a violent situation. It was over a year. I mean, it was violent. People was getting shot, innocent people in that area. So here we are after 10 years trying to maintain it, and it's rough. I ain't gonna lie to you, it's not easy.
It's
rough.
not easy. It could erupt at any moment. It could fall apart at any moment.
At any moment. And now we got to sit here and fight to try to secure the budget that we got in place to keep these people in place. And it's really a sad situation, man. That's why I'm kind of upset about it, because it shouldn't be. They should have took time out to say, what happened down there? Let's look at some of the archives. Let's look at some of the news clippings and see what took place. Oh, well, damn, that took place? Well, look, what's happening now? Let's go to LAPD and find out what's happening over there. Because you still got people that feel like it's unsafe, and it is.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah.
but yeah, I'm a testimony. I just don't come out and speak that much about it. But I'm one of those individuals, that came out of that life.
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't be able to do the work and identify with other people that's still involved if I didn't.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and one of the sad things is, and I'm not one to worry about my political career. In that piece last night, there were two supposed police officers, and I don't remember the exact dialogue, if they're current police officers, former police officers, or what have you. And the interviewer was describing them as going out on a limb and speaking ill of interventionists in a generic fashion, and they were being very derogatory toward interventionists and how they think it's phony and all that stuff. It's sad, That person was willing to take the time to allow to interview them and give some kind of credence to the idea that interventionists are all gang members. Yet at the same time, I don't see you as the kind of person to hide from somebody who wants to know the truth.
No.
But that person, I don't think that person doing that piece last night that came out on the news wasn't interested in the truth.
No.
They weren't interested in talking to you. They weren't interested in knowing you. They weren't interested in understanding you. And when I say you, the representative you as well.
Right.
And the fact of the matter is, it's a shame.
Yeah.
And I'm going to say it on the record.
Yeah.
I'm going to say it on the record. There's going to be policymakers heading for the hills
Yeah.
when it comes to intervention work, just because of that ignorant piece last night,
Yeah.
just because of the lies and the skewed version of what some person, I don't know if that person wants to get, I don't know, what do they give reporters? They give them some kind of award or something like that?
They were suspended.
No, what did it, not Nobel, Pulitzer, yeah.
Yeah. I think we
I don't know what that person was angling for, but it wasn't the truth.
we need to organize the intervention community and make a statement, because they can always say there was some bad apples in the community,
Sure.
and that's what they're gonna hang their hat on.
Hey, I'll dare say
Yeah.
there have been politicians who have had to step down because they involved themselves in activities that were not worthy of their responsibility as politicians.
Yeah.
There have been police officers, law enforcement officers who have had to do that. There have been judges who have had to do that.
Yeah.
There have been reporters that have been so grossly negligent in their responsibilities that have been fired as reporters. So in every walk of life, you're going to find individual human beings who are not upholding their responsibilities of their profession.
Yeah.
And if there's an interventionist out there who is not, then I think the sooner we find out, the sooner that person shouldn't be a part of the process.
Yeah.
Same thing with an officer. There was a notorious officer in the LAPD. I think it was Rafael Perez or what have you. Heaven forbid there should ever exist another Rafael Perez on any police department. So the fact of the matter is, I think it's inappropriate for anybody to, official or non-official, to paint any community with a broad brush.
Yeah.
And I think too often in this country, we allow our media to do that without being outraged and without letting them know that that's irresponsible. And it's a lie. It's a lie. Yeah. For that person to say, even to quote some, he hid his final statement in the form of a quote of saying that all interventionists are gang members, active gang members.
Imagine that.
That was less than the truth, and it was even, I think, a cowardly way of trying to make a point. If that person actually believes that, then that person should have said, this is what I think, and this is what I'm reporting, and this is what I have to say. I hope that person's listening to this dialogue, because there's too many people who could have pointed him toward a lot more truth in what he had to say. Yeah. Did he actually report on an individual who called themselves an interventionist, who was involved in gangs or what have you? I don't know. I don't know that individual. They had him on video saying that he was okay, but that's not a conclusion to say that all interventionists are gang members.
Yeah, peacemakers.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And in any community, there's going to be somebody who doesn't uphold their responsibilities. In every community. Well, I appreciate your testimony, and I appreciate you coming to the committee. And like I said earlier, this is all recorded, so this is all part of public comment, public document.
Thank you.
Okay.
All right.
Anybody else here for public comment on item number 2? Seeing and hearing none. Public comment on item number 2 is now closed. Item number 2, we'll move on, and we'll move off of item number 2 and note and file that report. Is there anybody here for general public comment? Seeing and hearing none. General public comment is now closed. This committee is now adjourned.